For years, Prince George has lived in the shadows of the throne, his every step watched, every word weighed. But no one expected his destiny to arrive this soon, this suddenly. When whispers began swirling through the palace corridors, few realized the truth. A seismic royal power shift had already begun, and George was at its very center. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. He was born into expectation, baptized in ceremony, and raised under the relentless gaze of a nation clinging to its monarchic traditions. From his earliest days, George's presence was not his own. His image curated, his moments choreographed, his silence observed as deeply as his words. But in recent months, the atmosphere surrounding the young prince began to change, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Guards rotated more frequently. Routes to school were altered. The palace press office fell unusually quiet. Whispers circulated in the media of missed photo ops, of events cancelled without explanation. Something, it seemed, was being concealed, shielded from public eyes with meticulous care. Within the walls of the monarchy, however, the signs were not subtle at all. Palace staff had noted sudden flurries of activity around George's schedule, including unscheduled briefings with state advisors who typically worked only with senior royals. One palace insider leaked a partial itinerary that detailed George's presence at a series of closed-door meetings. Meetings reportedly attended by senior government officials, military figures, and legal advisors. The leak was swiftly denied, of course, but denials often ring louder than confirmations, and this one only deepened the speculation. What was a child prince doing inside the stateroom at hours reserved for monarchs? Even more unsettling was the silence from the royal corps. King Charles, usually so publicly resolute in his duties, withdrew from key ceremonial events with little explanation. William and Catherine, too, refrained from public appearances. Their joint statements vanished, their social engagements suspended. When Catherine was spotted leaving the royal archives late one evening, carrying what appeared to be bound documents wrapped in velvet, the tabloids exploded with theories. And yet, the palace remained firm, no comment. Then came the rumours from within the royal staff. Tailors summoned in haste to prepare ceremonial uniforms in George's exact measurements. Visits to the royal vault under private guard. A royal guardsman allegedly overheard stating, "It's starting again, the procession rehearsals have begun." There had been no formal announcement, no invitation to the press, and yet, within the palace, something monumental was already unfolding. Beneath the surface of these whispers stood a child still navigating the transition from innocence to responsibility. Those close to the family speak of a different George behind closed doors, solemn, alert, and markedly more introspective than before. One staff member confided that George had stopped watching cartoons and had instead taken to reading speeches by Queen Elizabeth and handwritten letters by Prince Philip. Not for school, not for play, but for understanding what was expected of him and what burden he would soon be asked to carry. What no one outside the inner sanctum knew was that Parliament had already received the draft of a constitutional shift that would tie George's name to more than just ceremony. In a moment that shattered centuries of convention, Britain's Parliament received a bill unlike any seen before, one that didn't just adjust laws, but rewrote the soul of the monarchy. Behind closed doors, factions formed, voices rose, and allegiances fractured, all over one name, Prince George. The Royal Continuity Bill arrived in the chamber under the veil of confidentiality, but its gravity was undeniable. It was not just a ceremonial endorsement or symbolic gesture, it was a constitutional intervention, one that embedded Prince George's name into the mechanics of state power, before he had even reached adolescence. At the heart of the bill was a singular provision, the transfer of the Duke of Edinburgh title, not as a standalone honour, but as part of a broader transition plan that hinted at future sovereign functions. The implications struck at the very core of British tradition, and Parliament, long used to debating taxes and treaties, now found itself the custodian of royal destiny. What followed was unprecedented. As word of the bill's contents seeped through political ranks, both houses erupted into urgency. Emergency sessions were called, some stretching late into the night, with members debating not only legality but symbolism. Could the monarchy still claim neutrality if it orchestrated constitutional shifts around a child? Could Parliament afford to reject a proposal backed by the Crown without risking a fracture in national unity? The Commons became a battleground, not of party lines, but of ideology and legacy. Leaked footage only fanned the flames. In one now infamous clip, a senior Conservative MP is seen slamming a dossier on a desk, shouting, "This is not continuity, it's coronation by stealth." His words echoed across the chamber, while behind the scenes whispers multiplied. Had the palace overreached, or had it merely acted on a plan long in motion, one that was years in the making? The footage circulated like wildfire, igniting debate far beyond Westminster. Social platforms, radio shows, and political forums buzzed with theories, concerns, and passionate defenses. Every citizen now had an opinion on titles, on lineage, and on whether a new kind of monarchy was being quietly engineered. And then came the twist no one expected. A rare alliance emerged. Senior figures from both the Conservative and Labour benches, known adversaries in nearly all things, issued a joint statement supporting the bill. Their reason? Preservation of sovereign stability in an age of institutional uncertainty. It was vague, it was strategic, and it was effective. The momentum shifted. Momentum, once against the proposal, now surged forward, driven by an unspoken fear that rejecting the Crown in such a public fashion could trigger more chaos than compromise. But even amid this volatile unity, one absence loomed large. Queen Camilla, typically present for matters of constitutional resonance, was nowhere to be seen. Her scheduled appearances were quietly cancelled. Her patronages issued statements in her name but without her voice. Inside Parliament, her silence was interpreted as disapproval. Inside the palace, it meant something else entirely: withdrawal. And then, as whispers became roars, another revelation surfaced. Sources close to the parliamentary inquiry leaked that Prince William had addressed a confidential panel of senior MPs late one evening. No press, no cameras, no royal press office documentation. The future king had made his case not to the nation, but directly to the legislative body shaping his son's path. This was not protocol. This was persuasion, a move that shocked seasoned lawmakers, but one that clearly had its effect. But while Westminster was bracing for backlash, within the palace walls, the ceremonial preparations had already begun, and George wasn't alone in his ascent. As the ancient title of Duke of Edinburgh was readied for a child barely into his teens, Princess Catherine stood silently beside him, her eyes brimming not just with pride but with fear. William, stoic and restrained, whispered words to his son that would shake any parent to the core. The Queen's robing room, historically reserved for the sacred rituals of coronation and transition, became the private theatre for a moment of devastating significance. During a rehearsal closed off from all but a select few, Catherine reportedly broke down in tears as George stood, dressed in ceremonial rehearsal regalia, mimicking the role of a duke far older than his age. It wasn't the grandeur or pageantry that overwhelmed her. It was the unspoken truth that the life ahead of him had already begun to consume the one behind. In that silence, in that private room, the Crown had started its next era not with a declaration, but with a mother's quiet collapse. What followed next only deepened the weight. William, rarely prone to emotional display, leaned in close to George and said words that were later leaked through a source to a trusted royal correspondent. "You will never be a child again after this, not as a warning, not as a farewell, but as a fact, an unshakable line in the sand." And George, though barely capable of fully understanding the machinery around him, understood enough. That this was not pretend, that this moment wasn't just a pageant for photographers or a school assembly performance. It was the turning point of his life. Catherine's turmoil in those days was no secret to those closest to her. Though she appeared composed at public engagements, those within palace walls spoke of sleepless nights, prolonged silences, and moments where her voice would break mid-sentence. She had always known her son's life would be different. But nothing prepares a mother for the moment the child becomes a symbol. She confided, according to palace insiders, that she often looked at young George and saw shadows of Elizabeth II, those famous images of a young princess stepping into duty before she was truly ready. The resemblance wasn't just in lineage, it was in circumstance, in burden, in fate. And then came the journal entries leaked in fragments to a royal biographer by someone described only as within his educational circle. Lines scrawled with quiet despair, yet an eerie sense of responsibility. "They say I'm ready, but I don't know what that means," one line read. Another, more chilling, "I don't think I'm supposed to feel scared, but I am." These weren't the words of a rebellious teenager. These were the internal echoes of a child being fitted for the scaffolding of state. Behind the scenes, advisors were split. Some encouraged Catherine to present an image of maternal strength, assuring her that doubt would only rattle the already fragile consensus forming around George's appointment. Others, though fewer in number, privately questioned the timing. Was it too soon? Was George truly prepared? And most damning of all, was this truly his choice? And yet, amid Catherine's private sorrow, another power had already begun manoeuvring in the shadows. An old title was awakening, and an old adversary was not far behind. She had worn the crown. She had stood beside kings. But now, as the title of Duke of Edinburgh prepared to bypass every expectation, Queen Camilla stood alone in defiance, issuing a final challenge to the powers attempting to erase her legacy. For years, Camilla had maneuvered through the palace corridors with calculated confidence, gradually transforming public perception and tightening her grip on royal affairs. She was no mere consort. She was a strategist, a survivor. And yet, in this moment, this seismic transition that threaded Prince George into the very center of constitutional power, Camilla found herself completely outmaneuvered. The decision to pass over Prince Edward, long presumed to be the rightful heir to the Edinburgh title, was not just a break in tradition. It was a betrayal she believed had been orchestrated behind her back by a faction determined to rewrite the hierarchy, starting with her. According to multiple sources within the palace, what began as an unspoken tension exploded into confrontation behind closed doors. In the green drawing room, Camilla and Charles reportedly engaged in a heated exchange, so volatile that senior aides were ordered out mid-conversation. Her accusations were piercing. She demanded answers not just about Edward's omission, but about why she had not been consulted, not been warned. Her voice, usually composed and clipped in public, was described as furious and trembling. Charles, however, remained infuriatingly quiet. His refusal to respond, to even raise his voice in defense, was not perceived as dignity, but as dismissal. Camilla had faced media storms, public hatred, even royal protests, but never this kind of internal exile, silent and surgical. Then came the memo. Leaked to select journalists and quickly retracted from public view, it confirmed Camilla's request for a formal review of the title's reassignment. The request was denied within hours. No explanation, no deliberation, just an emphatic rejection, reportedly signed off by a royal advisor close to Prince William's office. The speed of the denial only confirmed what Camilla feared most, that the decision had been cemented long before she'd ever known it was on the table. The monarchy was moving fast and deliberately, and it no longer needed her permission. In the days that followed, the structure around Camilla began to fracture. Palace staff who had long served under her direction were quietly reassigned to new departments, some without warning, others without ceremony. Her inner circle, once robust and loyal, was being dismantled piece by piece, as though her influence was being erased not through scandal, but through quiet obsolescence. Those who remained loyal whispered of exile by design, of a queen being politely removed from the chessboard, while the next generation was crowned in influence. And then came the final insult. The crest, Camilla's personal insignia that had adorned ceremonial documentation for years, was removed. Not during a public announcement, not in a declaration, but in silence. The new draft materials for George's investiture bore only the crest of the monarch and the Wales line. Camilla's mark was gone, erased like ink wiped from parchment. It was a quiet erasure, but it was heard like a scream through every hall of the palace. While Camilla's influence waned, another royal matriarch took a bold step forward, one that would seal George's future and echo across every royal household. She has always been the monarchy's steel spine, unwavering, silent, loyal. But on this day, Princess Anne shattered expectations by doing the unthinkable, She defied royal protocol in open support of Prince George's new destiny, and in doing so, rewrote her role in history. For decades, Anne had been the fortress behind the crown. While others courted headlines and ceremonial pomp, she worked in silence, discreet, dutiful, and unshakably loyal to the institution. She had been there during Elizabeth's most fragile hours, during Philip's final days, and during Charles's tumultuous ascension. But when the monarchy found itself on the edge of generational upheaval, with Prince George thrust into the eye of history's storm, Anne stepped out from the shadows. In an unprecedented move, she assumed the chair of the Royal Succession Advisory Council, a role typically reserved for reigning monarchs or their direct heirs. The decision raised eyebrows across every corridor of power, signaling not just a personal choice, but an institutional recalibration. And it sent a message louder than any speech. Anne was taking sides. Her endorsement came swiftly and publicly. In a statement that struck the monarchy like a lightning bolt, she declared Prince George exceptionally prepared and morally anchored to assume responsibilities far beyond his age. She spoke not of bloodlines or protocols, but of character, of a future sovereign molded in duty, not entitlement. The statement stunned both royal traditionalists and political observers alike. Anne, the very embodiment of tradition, had just endorsed a future that shattered it, and she hadn't asked for permission. Then came the moment that sparked whispers in Westminster. Days before Parliament was due to vote on the Royal Continuity Bill, Anne arrived unannounced and unaccompanied at a late-night session of the Upper House. Her presence was not officially documented, no photographs, no recordings. But those inside the chamber later confirmed that she had taken a seat in the gallery reserved for ceremonial observers and remained there for nearly 3 hours. Some claim she met privately with senior peers afterward. Others say her appearance alone was enough to sway wavering votes. What was clear was this: she had crossed the boundary between symbolic royalty and strategic influence. At a formal council dinner days later, Anne slipped Catherine a sealed envelope, a note that at first remained private. But when its contents inevitably leaked, it caused a stir across every press office in the realm. It was a handwritten quote from Elizabeth II, dated decades earlier. "He who bears the crown's burden youngest, carries it deepest." There was no signature. Just those words, passed from one generation's matriarch to the next, a quiet blessing disguised as a memory. Behind closed doors, Anne reportedly spoke harshly of Camilla's opposition to the transition. Calling her behaviour disruptive to sovereign unity, Anne made clear that the monarchy could not survive if divided. Her stance wasn't personal, it was structural. The crown, she argued, could no longer afford internal fractures when the eyes of a skeptical public watched its every move. And while Anne and Charles were said to have met privately shortly after the council's decision, no statement was ever released. No photo surfaced. Whatever passed between them, whether reconciliation or reckoning, remains locked behind royal silence. But the outcome was unambiguous. Anne had thrown her weight behind George, not as a princess, not even as the king's sister, but as the monarchy's enforcer, its iron will made flesh. As Anne carved her approval in royal stone, the moment itself could no longer be delayed. George's formal investiture was upon them, but it would not unfold as expected. Under blinding lights and the silent watch of generations past, Prince George stepped forward, not just as a child of royalty, but as a bearer of the crown's most ancient burdens. The moment was supposed to be ceremonial. What happened instead stunned even the palace's most seasoned observers. Windsor Castle, the fortress of British legacy, had never seen such tension wrapped in such quiet spectacle. Security was absolute military precision cloaked in regal calm. Global news networks, foreign dignitaries, and even rival monarchies tuned in as Britain prepared to bestow one of its most powerful titles upon a boy barely into his adolescence. The anticipation was electrifying, but beneath the rehearsed elegance of the occasion, something far more potent simmered. This was not simply an investiture. This was a test, a signal, a controlled gamble disguised as tradition. As George entered the crown chamber, clad in ceremonial regalia not worn since Prince Philip's era, the weight of the moment could be felt in every restrained breath. Embroidered into his sash was the insignia of the Duke of Edinburgh, revived, recontextualized, and recast upon the shoulders of a boy not yet old enough to vote, yet already positioned to steer a nation's destiny. Standing nearby, Catherine's composure wavered for the first time since the transition began. Her hand clenched just slightly as George knelt before the crown. The symbolism was staggering. Her son was no longer a bystander in the family's story, he was now its centerpiece. Then came the twist. As the royal officiant began to read the declaration aloud, detailing the transfer of the title, its heritage, its obligations, he paused briefly, as though surprised by the next lines. Without warning or prior briefing to the public, an unexpected clause was introduced. Effective immediately, George would receive limited advisory privileges to the Crown Council. Though framed as a ceremonial inclusion, insiders understood the reality. This was a constitutional foothold. Not only was George being honoured, he was being empowered. The chamber froze. No one moved. Catherine glanced toward William, whose jaw had clenched at the exact moment the clause was uttered. George, clearly rehearsed for the rest of the ceremony, seemed momentarily caught off guard. He looked to his father with a question in his eyes. William, stoic and unwavering, offered only a slight nod. That was all it took. George turned back toward the assembly and, in a voice steadier than expected, affirmed the oath. What happened next would dominate headlines for days. As the final lines of the oath were read and George rose to receive the ceremonial seal, Parliament's live video feed abruptly cut to black. Official sources blamed a technical error. But in an age of information distrust and deep digital scrutiny, the explanation only fueled the fire. Conspiracy theories erupted within hours, claims that the clause had been inserted last minute, that Parliament had been bypassed, that George had become a proxy for covert monarchical consolidation. Nothing could be confirmed, and nothing could be denied. That was the brilliance and the danger of the maneuver. But as the echoes of the chamber faded, what emerged next was not unity but confusion, as Parliament prepared for something far greater than just a title. Buried deep within the fine print of the newly approved legislation was a clause so radical, so unprecedented, that even seasoned royal commentators were caught off guard. It didn't just affirm George's title, it positioned him within a system the monarchy had never dared formalize. Until now. Clause 8th, a line of text that changed everything. Hidden beneath the expected ceremonial language of hereditary appointment and symbolic duties, it was this clause that electrified the political establishment and shook the monarchy from within. It granted Prince George something never before given to a royal so young: access to early Crown Council sessions, and most shockingly, the right to undergo formal training in emergency veto powers. This was no longer about a boy inheriting a title. This was the deliberate acceleration of a sovereign in waiting, a child not merely learning by observation, but being ready to act in moments of constitutional crisis. It was a structural reimagining, and its implications were staggering. Once this clause surfaced after the live stream glitch was corrected and the legal documentation leaked to a handful of MPs, the backlash began. The Parliamentary Review Board, already frayed by the secrecy surrounding the bill's formation, erupted in internal debate. Some members openly accused the monarchy of manipulation, of using the cover of ceremonial change to embed long-term dynastic strategy into law. Others, equally powerful, insisted it was an essential move for future continuity, a preventative measure in a world teetering on political unpredictability. The rift wasn't along party lines, it was generational, a clash of worldviews, old guard Republicans versus new era royalists, and caught between them the image of a young prince who never asked to become the symbol of national contingency. Inside the palace, the situation was no less volatile. Sources close to Catherine confirmed that she had voiced serious personal hesitation regarding Clause 8. She feared its implications on George's mental and emotional health, concerned that he was being drafted into the machinery of governance before his voice had even finished changing. But her objection, raised during a high-level strategy meeting, was overruled. The decision, she was told, had been endorsed by the Royal Strategic Continuity Committee, a previously obscure body now wielding enormous influence under the guise of institutional preservation. For Catherine, it was a quiet devastation. For George, a silent inheritance of pressure. Commentators soon began describing the arrangement not as a symbolic title handover, but as the beginning of a soft co-regency. George and William, father and son, positioned not in ceremonial orbit of each other, but in a slowly converging lane of shared responsibility. It was an unprecedented dynamic, a king in waiting already being shadowed by the future king behind him. The internet ignited. Political analysts clashed on national television. Hashtags like #PrinceVeto and #FutureCrown trended globally. Public support was sharply divided, some applauding the modernization of the monarchy, others demanding accountability for a transition that had occurred without public mandate. But this wasn't just a legal maneuver or a constitutional novelty. It was a generational detonation. And while political circles scrambled to interpret the future, within the palace walls, George's inheritance was already breeding envy and activating long-dormant rivalries. Titles come with power, but power breeds resentment. As Prince George rose, others in the royal line felt the ground shift beneath their feet, most notably those who once believed the Duke of Edinburgh title would be theirs. Forgotten, sidelined and silenced, they are now speaking out. Prince Edward, for years, was the quiet constant within the royal machine, never the centre of attention, but always the expected successor to his father's legacy. The Duke of Edinburgh title was never just symbolic for him. It was a fulfillment of a promise, one quietly agreed upon by the late Queen and Prince Philip. So when news broke that the title had not only been reassigned, but fast-tracked to a generation below him without his direct involvement, the silence from Edward's office spoke louder than any official protest. No statement, no appearance. Just a haunting void where tradition used to stand. But the silence didn't last. Leaked internal communications from the Earl of Wessex's office began to surface notes between senior staff that hinted at deep betrayal. It was taken, read one message, not offered. Another, more direct, we were bypassed by design. No names were attached. No confirmation followed bar. But the suggestion was unmistakable. This wasn't a generational transition. It was a calculated override. Around the same time, whispers began circling from the fringes of the royal sphere. Zara Tindall, respected yet often positioned outside the core line of succession, found her name inserted into headlines not for anything she said, but for what her allies were beginning to question. Was the crown bypassing experienced royals in favour of reshaping its image around youth? Had the institution decided that continuity now required symbolism over service? Those close to Zara reportedly expressed frustration that her lifelong loyalty had been repaid with exclusion. Though she maintained public silence, her absence from recent palace briefings was noted and not ignored. Meanwhile, the Duchess of Edinburgh, Sophie, made an unusual request. Sources close to Catherine confirmed that Sophie sought a private audience not through official royal channels, but quietly, discreetly. What was discussed, if the meeting happened at all, remains unconfirmed. But in the days that followed, senior aides in both households were reshuffled, as if lines of communication were being redrawn from within. What emerged in the vacuum of transparency was something far more dangerous: speculation. A growing chorus of lesser royals and long-standing aides began proposing the idea of a parallel honours council, a body that could advise on titles and roles without interference from the dominant Windsor circle. It was more symbolic than operational, but the implication was clear. Discontent was no longer whispered, it was becoming organised. The media pounced. Headlines across Europe framed it as a youth coup, a monarchy shedding its elders and reshaping itself in the image of its youngest. Prince George became the unintended emblem of that transformation. Not by choice, but by consequence. And with every passing day, the once ceremonial investiture now felt like a lightning rod drawing out rivalries that had long slept under the surface of royal unity. But as royal tension simmered, one voice cut through the confusion with unwavering clarity, a voice from the past, whose vision for the future now seems frighteningly real. Before her passing, Queen Elizabeth II left behind a sealed document known only to the Royal Archives as Appendix Windsor IV. What it contains has never been officially released. But as George assumes his role under this new constitutional paradigm, whispers suggest the Queen foresaw it all. For years, Appendix Windsor IV was little more than a myth, a phantom footnote in conversations among the upper echelons of the royal inner circle. Archived under lock and cipher, its title alone became a source of curiosity, then speculation, and eventually reverence. Only a handful of individuals were granted access during the Queen's lifetime, and none were permitted to copy or quote it. But now, in the aftermath of Prince George's unprecedented rise, an insider close to the Royal Archives has confirmed its existence, and more importantly, its purpose, a succession continuity document authored by Elizabeth herself, written not for her immediate heir, but for her grandson's generation. The timing was not coincidence, it was intention. The language, described as spiritually urgent yet legally restrained, reportedly framed George not just as an heir, but as a future anchor in times of institutional fragility. It outlined transitions of trust, patterns of guidance, and a subtle warning about relying too heavily on tradition without moral clarity. It was less a mandate and more a map quietly pointing toward a future the Queen sensed long before her final bow. And as George stood at the precipice of a new kind of monarchy, many began to believe this moment had been written long before it was spoken aloud. Behind the grandeur of the investiture, a quiet storm brewed between Catherine and William. Multiple sources confirmed that the couple spent weeks poring over the Queen's appendix, torn between loyalty to her wishes and concern for their son's readiness. Catherine, protective and measured, reportedly urged restraint. William, guided by an invisible sense of duty shaped by his grandmother's wisdom, insisted that the crown must not delay its course. They were not debating titles, they were deciding the future, and the balance between legacy and love was as fragile as the document they held. In the end, it was Charles who broke the deadlock. Though publicly distant from the controversy, the king reportedly authorized a subtle but deliberate amendment to the official language of George's investiture. It was a single sentence, not found in any prior draft, inserted by hand at the 11th hour. Palace sources say it echoed a private phrase Elizabeth had once written to Charles in a letter kept in her personal prayer book: "Let the youngest know, before the oldest fade." It was not an order, it was a blessing. And as the ceremonies ended and the world turned its gaze to other matters, one moment stood apart from the rest, unannounced and undocumented. Prince George was seen, quietly and alone, returning to the Queen's private chapel at Windsor. No fanfare, no press. Just a boy stepping into the space where a monarch had once asked the heavens for guidance. It was there, witnesses say, that he stood the longest. Now the conversation has shifted. This was never just about a title. It was about preparing the crown for something far beyond the public's comprehension. Appendix Windsor IV may have outlined succession, but it also hinted at transformation, a monarchy not defined by age or lineage, but by who carries the weight of the realm when no one else can. And in George, the Queen may have seen not a shadow of the past, but the shape of what's to come. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.